Recording in progress.
Okay, and then you'll begin starting the class, okay?
All right.
Hey, I can hear myself, so that's good.
Hi there. I'm so sorry. This is Karen Lloyd for all of the delay. Do I still have the class here?
You still have a class here, Karen. It looks like there's several of us online. Sweet, thank you, Janice.
No one's talking, but so how do I hear back?
So if they do talk out loud, you'll hear back, but they are chatting that yes, you're online, so they can hear you. So I'm gonna go ahead and let you go. You can go ahead and just leave class.
But I can't hear them.
We're here, Karen.
Okay. All right. I got you now. I think somebody.
Thank you.
All right, you guys. Thank you.
Everyone.
All right, you guys, I'm so sorry for the technical delays. None of us could get into Zoom, and then I had my own personal technical difficulties. So, hi, who do I have on the line? Because I cannot see you guys. Let's see. How many do I have? Are you guys still there?
We can hear you.
Janice Maynard is here.
Okay, who else have I got?
LaShonda Cox is here.
All right.
Alicia Prescott is here.
Okay, and can you guys tell me how much experience that you have in real estate? How long you've been a realtor?
I've been in for 9 years.
Okay.
This is my first full year. I haven't done any South Carolina.
Okay. Who else do I have? Daisy, are you on?
I've been in real estate 2 years.
Okay. LaShonda?
This is my first full year and
Oh.
I don't have any South Carolina closings, so I'm very interested in this.
All right. Let's see, Sharon? Sharon's not on. Michelle? Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute it. Let's see. Well, I can't add, but since 96.
Okay. All right. So we have a mix of experience. All right, great. Okay. So for all of you who have been in real estate for a while and who have done South Carolina contracts before, there is only one paragraph that has changed. This is not going to be too much difference from you. Basically, what they have done for all of those who are experienced with it is they have taken out the repair request section. They have taken out the as-is section, and the remainder of the contract is the same. It's really not any different. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to take everybody line by line, not quite line by line, but I'm going to take you through each area of the South Carolina contract. The good thing is for the people who have used the old South Carolina contract, if you haven't used the South Carolina contract before, then you don't have to worry about the way it used to be. And so you don't have to change anything. Okay, so we're starting with this. South Carolina is considerably different than North Carolina. In North Carolina, when you submit the, when the contract is executed, then you send in the due diligence money. The big key thing here in South Carolina is you do not submit the due diligence or the other, they call it the termination fee. You do not submit that at the time. You hold on to it. It's only written if it is terminated. So big difference. That's the big difference between North Carolina and South Carolina. So you do not write that check, which brings up its own set of problems. But we'll go through this. Okay, so the first, number one, you just put the buyer's name and the seller's name. Always go to York County GIS. If you do not know the names, if you are the buyer side, and I assume Sabre didn't tell me if I'm doing buyers or not, but I think I am. I'm doing the buyers side on these on these forms. So if you're the buyer, then and you want to go to York County GIS, there are two ways to get to York County GIS to find out the seller's name. And that is, you can go to MLS and you can click on the parcel ID. And that parcel ID will take you to the GIS system in York County, and it will give you the seller's name. The GIS system will also give you a lot of other information. If you're not familiar, let me stop and ask, is everyone familiar with the GIS system in York County? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Everyone knows that what's that system is and how to get to it. If for some reason you can't get to it from the parcel ID, then you will actually go into yorkcountygov.com and you'll go to the GIS system and you can search there by the name or by address or by parcel ID to get the seller's name. So that's very, very important, because if you get into a situation where it's an estate, then the estate has to be changed. The name has to be changed to the new owner's name in order to sell that. And that can take a long time if it's not. So, you know, if you're going out on a, I'm getting sidetracked here, but if you're going on a listing appointment, always pull up that GIS first to see whose name it is, to make sure that you don't have that situation to go through. If it is an estate, then they need to, and the name has not been changed, then you will need to advise them to go to an attorney, because that will need to be changed. So, and like I said, that can take several weeks. So you get the seller's name from GIS, then you go down to, and you fill that out, go down to closing attorney C, put in the closing attorney's name there, whoever the buyer is wanting to use as their closing attorney. Please don't forget to fill that in. Then you go down to the next section underneath F, and you will put in that if it is a client of yours or a customer of yours. Then the purchase price. Then underneath number 2, payable by transfer of goods via finance or combination of finance or cash. If you are a combination, and it is, for example, if they're putting 50% cash down, then you're going to want to come down to the next line and you want to get verification of cash. I personally get, it's a sum of money of over $10,000. I ask for them to give me verification of cash. Verification of cash can be multiple different venues. You can just ask for an online document with their account number X'd out, so you can't see that information, and make sure it has the bank's name on it and it has their name on it. So, and then you would check attached or not attached to be delivered on or before, and you put a date in there. Not all agents do it that way, but I have seen it where there's a large amount of cash. The agent thought it was finance, that all they had to do was worry about the finance and the pre-approval, but actually they didn't have the funds on the back end as they said they did. So make sure you get that. Okay, this contract is not contingent upon the sale and closing of a buyer's real property. And then South Carolina Form 504 is or is not attached. You need to attach and fill out South Carolina 504, and that's a whole nother form that needs to be completed, which talks about the contingency if it is contingent upon the sale of the closing person's buyer's real property. And if we get a chance to go into that form today, then I'll go back to it, but look at South Carolina R 504. So I don't know how many people are doing contingencies right now. However, that form must be filled out and completed if it is contingent. Okay, property. Here you just put the address, the city, the zip, the lot, the block, the county, subdivision. Make sure that tax map number is correct. Check on all of your contracts, every one of your contracts. Make sure that you verify whether you're the seller or the buyer. Make sure that that tax number is correct, because the attorney is going to be researching off that tax map number. And I have seen it where the wrong tax map number was written and the attorney did the wrong research. So I don't care what side you're on. If you're like I said, if you're the buyer, the seller, whatever, just make sure that that tax number is correct. Okay, parties agreed that no personal property would transfer as part of the sale except described below. Here, if you're including the washer, the dryer, the refrigerator, make sure you put that here. The MLS is just an advertisement. If the MLS says that the refrigerator is included and you do not put it here, the seller can absolutely keep that refrigerator, because MLS, so whatever you, for those three things, that's all you can put there. If there are any other items, you must do a bill of sale. Don't put them here because the loan officers do not want to see it. So just do a bill of sale and you can handle that way. All right, then at the bottom of the page, you have the buyer and the seller. Make sure that it's initial. Okay, closing. Closing date, you put in the closing date. And then you state on the next few lines there, the title that the buyer wants to see recorded, whatever name that they want there. All right, number 5, earnest money. Put in the total number of earnest money. We're going to talk a little bit about earnest. I'm going to come back to earnest money when we have the when we go through due diligence, because the two of them are hand in hand now. I will tell you something about earnest money here. If you go over $7,500 in earnest money, if it goes to lawsuit, then it cannot be in small claims court. You would have to get an attorney. So if you're on the buyer side, you want to keep it underneath $7,500 if possible. If you're on the seller side, of course, you want more than $7,500. But, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next paragraph on what happens if you do go to court. So you put in the total dollars of earnest money there. You say how much earnest money accompanies this offer, or how much will be paid by 6 o'clock on the date. Make sure you fill that in. That's a date. And then make sure also you check whether it's check or cash. Most times check. I don't never know when you would use cash. I don't know why they even have that on there. And then you put that same total amount will be credited to the buyer at closing or dispersed only as parties agree in writing. Make sure that that is all correct. We received a contract the other day and she was going to give $2,000 earnest money, but she was only going to give the buyer, she was only going to deliver $1,000 earnest money. And I kept telling her, you've got to deliver the total amount, but for some reason she just couldn't understand that. She thought she could just deliver partial. And I said, no, whatever earnest money you commit to, that's the amount that you have to give to whoever is holding, whether it's an attorney or whoever's holding the money for you. But then you, in the next line, the buyer seller authorize, I always use an attorney's firm, and just list here who that escrow agent is. Okay, so excuse me. Sorry, I thought I had cut that off. So in the next section, this section here states how much money it will cost if you have to execute a lawsuit. With this, I've always put in $90. I've seen $100. I've seen $110. But you know, I guess it all just depends on where you're executing it. But these are, this is to be paid to the escrow agent by the parties so they can start the lawsuit. Something about a lawsuit, I will tell you guys, if you do get into a lawsuit, the loser pays the winner's attorney's fees and court fees. So just make sure you're clear about that. So, which it doesn't seem right, but that's just the way it is on this contract. And I've seen contracts go either way when you go to court. Just depend on who the judge is. Sometimes you get a judge that's not familiar with real estate, and they do, the outcome is not what you expect. Okay, transaction costs. A lot of times this is skipped. Transaction costs, just to boil down, is basically who's going to pay, either it's the seller or the buyer, who's going to pay the cost to sell the house. Now, a lot of the subdivisions are getting into this because their HOAs get the money. Baxter has a pretty significant transaction fee. So if this is not checked, it defaults back to the seller. The attorney will default that to the seller. All right. We're on the third paragraph right now. So closing cost. This is where the buyer is asking for the seller to pay closing costs, so the buyer can finance their closing costs with the loan. Happens all the time. This amount here is a dollar amount that you put in of how much you want them to pay, knowing that the net, it will be a net to the seller of the sale price minus the closing costs, and that is the net to the seller. All right, then have that page initialed as well. Finance. Finance is or is not contingent, and make sure that you write whether you check whether it's 30 or 15 year or other, and make sure that you put down the percentage of the purchase price of the appraised value, or whichever is lower. So that's the percentage that they are going to finance. Then put in here that the financing, who the financing is by. And then also you need to put in here when they are going to start their finance. And so it says no unreasonable credit income assets by X date. That's the date that you'll have final approval that you anticipate. And pay attention to these dates, because if you don't have that, like if you put October 30th and you don't have that letter by October 30th, then there needs to be a discussion between the buyer's agent and seller's agent as to what's going on. And you need to let your client know that you didn't receive that. During the finance period, the seller must notify on how many days if they change lenders. So you just determine there, is it, you're going to give 2 days, 1 day, whatever, and let the, that's if they decided to change. I will tell you that if they do change, and they do not notify you that they changed, because I just recently went through this. It's not something that I would sue over. It's just more of a headache. So just pay attention to your dates. If you see the date's going to be missed, pick up the phone and call, because the whole point in these contracts is not to sue anyone, it's to get it to the closing table. So you might have an agent on the other end that's not paying attention to dates, but you should pay attention to dates. So I never put so it's kind of like, some people say, well, that's not my responsibility. Well, yeah, it is, because you're on the other party and you're trying to get it to the closing table for your client too. So if you see it's going to be missed, just call and ask. Lender, whoever the lender is, if it's FHA, VA, conventional, seller, or other. If it is an FHA, then you have to attach another addendum, the FHA VA financing addendum. And basically what that addendum says is that the house must appraise for the sale price. We'll go into that if we have time. All right, due diligence. Okay, prior to June 13th of this year, we had a contract that had 3 different ways that you could do inspections. One was repair request, which I personally liked a whole lot, much better than this. You basically would agree to repairs on the major infrastructure. There were 9 major infrastructure things. You agree to those repairs, seller will do them, buyer goes, and everybody goes on about their way. You did have due diligence, which I never used because I thought it could get very sticky, and it does, and it is now. And then you had an as is. Understand this South Carolina contract is an as-is contract. The seller has to do nothing.
Hey, Jesse. Doing okay in a class right now on Zoom, but I just
Hey.
wanted to make sure that it wasn't anything important I needed to talk to you about.
Hey there, someone's not on Zoom, on mute. I don't know who that is.
Okay. Oh,
Maybe they'll stop here in a minute. Okay.
well, good. That's good to know, even though it's going up because of his accident. So,
You guys, if you could all put yourselves on mute so we don't hear other conversations. Okay. All right. So this due diligence period, the due diligence period begins upon the effective date and shall expire at 6 p.m. on a date. Now that's a date, that's a negotiable date that you can negotiate with the seller. So I'm going to toggle back and forth in this paragraph right here. Then if you go down to termination, that's the fee that the buyer must pay if they determine that they're going to terminate this contract during that due diligence timeframe. So I'm going to talk about, so you have in this contract 3 other contingencies. You have, if it doesn't appraise, the buyer does not have to buy. If the CL 100 does not come in and pass, the buyer does not have to buy. Or if the buyer's financing falls through. So there are 3 other ways to get out of this contract by the buyer. Other than that, if during this due diligence period, you put out a date, the seller agrees, and you put a termination fee, if you terminate for any reason, then you have to pay that termination fee. So make sure you understand that during that due diligence period, seller agrees, buyer may rely on the following list of 5 items in accordance with contract and law. These 5 items are: they can conduct inspections, the buyer conduct inspections, deliver a repair request. Now the repair request is form 525. And that's where you as a buyer would put on form 525 what it is that you're asking for the seller to do. This is real clear. If on form 525, 10 things are written out and the seller says, yes, we agree, we'll do them all, then due diligence is over. I don't care if it was supposed to go through October 30th, but if you're on October 1st and you agree to repairs, due diligence is over. They cannot terminate after that time frame unless there are those other 3 contingencies that come into play. Is that everyone understand that?
Can you tell me again what those 3 were? I know that you said appraisal and then you said
If the house does not appraise, if the buyer does not get financing, and if the CL 100 is not clear and the seller will not fix it. Those are the 3 other contingencies in this contract. So, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but understand the point that I want to make here is that you must put on this repair request 525 all requests and give them the form, the reports of what you're asking to be fixed. Understand the seller does not have to do any of it. If the seller says no, like I've got one right now, and it needs a lot of repairs, and seller said no, said I'm not doing it. I'm going to tell you something else he did. And the CL 100, it didn't pass either. And the seller said, I'm not doing anything. Can the buyer get out of it? Absolutely. Can the buyer get his earnest money back? Absolutely. Does the buyer have to pay the due diligence? No, the termination fee. I'll interchange. Let me make sure you guys understand. I'll interchange due diligence fee with termination fee. It's the same thing in my mind. Okay. So make sure I don't confuse you guys. So what's happened in that situation? The seller wouldn't fix. The CL 100 was not clear. In that situation, the buyer can get out without paying the due diligence fee, and he gets his earnest money back. But he's paid for all those inspections. Seller walks away. His house has been off the market now, but he doesn't have to do a thing. A seller does not have to do a thing. So just remember that. So if the repair request comes in and you can't negotiate, then you can terminate the contract. You can proceed then as an as-is contract, or you just try to negotiate. So it gets confusing because on the CL 100, the buyer can get out without paying the termination fee. If for any other reason they want to get out other than finance or appraisal, then they have to pay the termination fee. So here in South Carolina, it's different. Due diligence wasn't used as much as what repair request was used. And so the buyers in South Carolina are like, what? Wait a minute, this favors the seller because the seller doesn't have to do anything. And I personally think it does. I think and we, when we were in class learning about these contracts, I mean, that was our opinion, and we tried to explain that to the attorney, but it was like, well, it is what it is. So the seller what hurts the seller is they just had their house off the market. The other thing that can hurt the seller, though, is if, for example, the buyer goes underneath there, finds or if the buyer does the inspections and tells the seller that he's got all these problems, well, and the seller then learns that, he's got to go back to that property disclosure and disclose all those things. So it gets a little bit complicated. So they may have some skin in the game. All right. If you're going to terminate, if the buyer says, okay, it's just too much stuff on this inspection report, I want to execute the due diligence, then the buyer has to submit at that time a check. Whatever this termination fee is, that's underneath termination, the check and Form 313, make sure you write that down. Form 313 must be provided to the agent, along with the agreement for earnest money, which actually terminates. There's a termination form, and let's see, what is the number of that termination form? Well, 313 is the notice of termination. 313, that's it. So the check to terminate, Form 313, and then you also the agreement for earnest money and who's to get the earnest money. So those are the things that if you're going to terminate, 3 things. So make sure that the agent gets that. That's the process. I know it can be confusing, but the thing, just to sum this up, is financing, appraisal, or CL 100. With this, if the buyer doesn't get the appraisal, the seller doesn't get the house doesn't appraise, buyer doesn't get financing, or the seller will not fix the CL 100, and then those are the things that they can get outside of due diligence. But in due diligence, make sure you submit those 3 things. Any question about that?
Hey, Karen. So I just want to understand, so does it make sense if a buyer has a low appraisal to wait until after due diligence to terminate, so they don't have to pay the termination fee?
It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter. The appraisal came in, and it's not based on due diligence, then it's based on appraisal. It's based on the appraisal, because in your contract on page 10, not page 10, under number 10, let's skip down to number 10 real fast. Okay, appraised value. If you check, this contract is contingent upon the property being valued according to the lender's appraisal or other appraisal as agreed upon by parties for the purchase of the hire. If the parties are made aware that the appraised value is less than the purchase price and the seller delivers notice to the buyer within 5 calendar days. This is also very, very key, you guys. Make sure you understand your time frames in this contract. In this contract, everything is a calendar day, no business days. Used to be back in the day, several years ago, you had some business days, you had some calendar days. They switched it all to calendar days. So if the seller delivers notice to the buyer within 5 calendar days or closing, whichever is earliest, of an amendment to reduce the purchase price to the appraised value, the parties agree to proceed under terms of this contract with purchase price amended to be appraised. If seller is aware and refuses to reduce as stated above, buyer may proceed to closing or terminate this contract by delivering notice of termination to the seller.
Okay, so it doesn't matter that
No,
earlier in the contract, it states if it's terminated during due diligence, the termination fee is due.
that is for those for repair requests. That
Okay,
does not come into play for appraisal.
got it.
And yeah, and that's where this gets very confusing. That's where it does get confusing. But if you're following the appraisal,
Well, what about a termite inspection?
that's the CL 100. That's separate. Let's go down to that. All right, let me get down to the CL 100. Wood infestation, number 11. It states here that you're going to have the buyer. Normally the buyer always does it, except there's one time. Does anybody know when the seller does the wood infestation? Do I
If
have-
it's a veteran,
Yeah, very good. If it's a VA loan, the seller has to pay for the CL 100. If it's a veteran, if it's a VA loan, understand that. So when you get that contract in as a seller, you see that, you make sure that you tell the seller, you got to pay for the CL 100. They get upset if they don't know that. Okay.
Karen, hi, this is Sharon Finch. I do have a question for you. So let's just talk about this South Carolina contract offer to purchase versus the North Carolina. In other words, it is based on the appraisal price, and in North Carolina, it is not. The offer to sell price and the appraisal price, when it's not an FHA or VA, that doesn't matter.
Right, because in North Carolina, you have to execute during due diligence. Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah, that's exactly right. Due diligence is completely different in North Carolina. And I am licensed in North Carolina, but I don't have a contract in front of me, and I don't know if it's based on appraisal. You're saying it's not? So if it doesn't appraise, there's not a section in North Carolina contract that says it
no,
must.
absolutely not. Whenever you can go back and try to negotiate whatever the appraisal price was, but in North Carolina, if they will not agree to reduce the price to the appraisal price, the buyer is still responsible for paying the difference.
Okay.
That's why all these attorneys drew up these little addendums that make you say you'll pay a difference over 10,000 or 15,000 over appraisal price. But really, no matter what, that buyer is still responsible for that offer sales price.
Okay, that's good to know. Well, that's the difference between North Carolina and South Carolina. In South Carolina, you have the section in section 10, this section right here that says it when you check 1. This contract is contingent upon the property being valued according to the lender's appraisal or other appraisal as agreed. If it doesn't, the parties can agree to proceed to closing underneath the terms. they can renegotiate. But if they don't, the buyer may proceed to closing, or the buyer can terminate this contract by delivering notice of termination to the seller. That's the difference. It's a big difference. North Carolina and South Carolina are completely different. Now, if you check this contract is not contingent upon the property being valued, then you're stuck there. All right, so going down to the CL 100 again. It says here, and be clear on the CL 100, that if the wood infestation report reveals the presence or indication or damages by termite infestation or other wood destroying organisms, seller shall remedy such deficiencies and shall furnish the buyer with a CL 100 wood infestation report by a qualified person. So if he refuses to do that, it says that if you go a little bit longer, a little bit further in the paragraph, if the seller does not make the repairs and treatment, the buyer shall have the option to accept the property, negotiate with the seller, or terminate this agreement. That's outside. That is outside this due diligence here.
Okay, so what you're saying is, when you terminate during due diligence, it's only, so you can terminate during due diligence for a low appraisal or for a CL 100 that isn't clear without paying the termination fee.
That's correct, because
Okay.
this contract is contingent upon financing, appraisal, and CL 100. That's
Okay.
correct. The due diligence is for repairs. And again, you'll put your repairs on form 525. And here's the other big thing. Remember this, write this down. If everybody agrees to this 525 form, the repair request, the due diligence is over. Even if the due diligence period right here is not over. Make sure if everybody agrees, it's over. You can't go back. It used to be in the old contract, you could go back because of the date that everyone agreed to getting the seller the repair request information. Not on this form. It's over. So just make sure. So that's the main takeaways from this. So again, due diligence, appraisal, CL 100, and financing. All separate. Let me look at my notes here. All right, when you terminate, if you decide to terminate, the termination fee must be delivered by 6 p.m. to either the listing agent or the seller of the date of termination. So make sure you know that. You got to get them that termination fee. So your client, your buyer, if they decide to terminate, they got to get it to you, and you got to get it to that other agent. You got to get to the agent or the seller, whichever way. Now, there's lots of discussion about, can I Venmo, which I love Venmo. Can I do it some other way? Yes, you can, but make sure that you get approval from all parties and make sure that it's documented. Make sure that you got an email. Yes, Venmo it to Karen-Lloyd-60, $5,000, and make sure that that is all in an email and that you documented. And there's not a form for it, but I personally would have someone sign a document that said, yes, that I gave them the termination fee. When it comes to terminating the termination fee, earnest money, does it automatically go back to the seller or the buyer? This is where you have to deliver that notice as well. Again, there could be a dispute on who gets it. So, and neither party can automatically get the earnest money. It's just, it's not like you can't say, I'm terminating doing this repair request, I'm getting the earnest money back. Well, the other party might not think so. So that can be a little pull and tug there. So that's why you want to give those 3 things at the time of termination. Get the check, get the termination document, form 313, and then the agreement for earnest money document. Does that make sense? Okay, if the seller does not respond to repair request, so let's just say someone's I'm selling my home and some Jojo wants to buy my house. Well, Jojo sends in the repair request. I completely ignore it. And the date of the hard date here, this termination date is coming up right here. And the termination date's coming up. What happens? Karen's not getting back to me on this repair request. And I want these things. But she's not getting back to me. Then the buyer at the time has to decide what they're going to do. If the buyer wants to terminate, he has to terminate by that deadline. It's not an excuse that the seller didn't get back to me. He still has to go ahead and pull the trigger as to what he wants to do. So the seller doesn't even have to get back in touch with the buyer about the repair request. Doesn't that sound bad? But they do not. If the buyer, again, like I said, if the buyer terminates because of financing, no termination fees, it's owed, even if it's terminated during due diligence. Okay, you'll get in a situation too that the lender requires repairs. Again, that has to be agreed upon. Seller doesn't have to do anything. Seller doesn't even have to respond to a repair request.
Hey, Karen.
Uh-huh.
I have another question. If the seller doesn't respond to your repair request to protect a client, if you want to terminate, I mean, would you owe that termination fee?
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you have any recourse like
No.
after that?
No. Mm-mm. That's why if the seller's not responding and your buyer says, if I don't get these repairs, I want out, then you as an agent have to make sure that you're watching that date very carefully and know when you're getting close to it. And then you have to call them and say, hey, you better execute now. We're not hearing back from them. So you better execute or you're not going to get it. Because then if it falls outside the due diligence period, and unless it's financing, appraisal, CL 100, they're going forward. So make sure I always tell all agents, make sure that you pay close attention to your dates. During the due diligence period, the seller can continue to show. Let's see, I'm going to just some more notes here, make sure I'm covering everything. If you, again, put it in writing if you're going to terminate where the check goes and have someone sign it. And also they recommended take a selfie. That sounds silly, but we were told by an attorney, take a selfie because there's no receipt to complete. Do not have the client that termination fee write out the check to you at the time of earnest money, because it was asked, well, should we get the termination fee at the time we're getting the earnest money fee? No. Who's going to hold it? The attorneys aren't going to hold it. There might be some attorney out there now that's holding it, but at the time, and you can't, and unless you have I don't know the process, let's put it this way, for an agent to hold it. I would think you'd have to have a trust account of some type if you were going to do that, but I wouldn't want to do it. So do not get that termination fee at the time you get the earnest money. Let's see what else. I'm just looking over some more notes, make sure. You can use the Venmo. Again, do not get that termination fee. So what do you do if a client's out of town? And they want to, the client's out of town, this date is closely approaching. What do? You got to somehow get that money. So again, this is where dates are, you got to be very careful on your dates, and you got to know where your client is at all times. If they go out of town, you've got to make some type of arrangement to get that termination fee if they want to terminate. Again, do not hold it. So be very careful about that. Again, you cannot piecemeal the repair request once signed, the due diligence period is over. Never write the word as is as an alternative. Make the due diligence very short if you can, and make the termination fee high. Okay, so this is the big challenge. People ask me all the time, how much termination fee? How much earnest money? Well, that all depends. There's no formula anymore. Normally we said 1% of the earnest money. But these aren't typical times. And then how much of the termination fee? What the highest that you could get is what I say, because if you go through due diligence and the seller doesn't do any repairs and the buyer misses that due diligence period, but then wants to back out, well, the seller gets to keep the earnest money at that point. So theory is, but again, you have to go through the motion of trying to get it back to the seller to keep it, and the buyer saying, well, no, I should get it. And here, let me give you an example. There's one example. This was the case, and it skipped missed the due diligence period. The buyer did. Buyer then says it's outside the due diligence period. He says, I get to keep the earnest money because the seller says, I get to keep the earnest money because the buyer didn't qualify for financing. Well, you think that was a clear-cut case, right? Buyer gets the earnest money he gets his money back because he didn't qualify for financing. Well, you remember how I was talking about, it depends on the judge that you get. Well, in this particular situation, the seller got to keep the earnest money. The reason why? Because the seller proved that the buyer was not financially sound and that they didn't pay their bills on time. And if they had paid their bills on time, they would have qualified for financing. And the judge agreed with them. So my whole point in telling you all of this is while we can state what this contract has, if you're going to go to court, there's no telling how it's going to come out. So we've actually gone to court over inspections that were clearly, this is with the old contract that the seller should have repaired. According to the contract, no, the judge ruled in favor of the buyer, said that was no need to do those repairs. So while this is all a framework, if you get down to going into a lawsuit, it all depends on what the judge says. Now, is that about make it confusing? Yes, it does. All right. All right, so moving on from due diligence. Is everybody good with that? Any questions? Oh, there's just one other thing that I do want to tell you. You cannot write non-refundable earnest money on these contracts. Never write that. You cannot do that. That's according to the South Carolina attorney. All right. On that repair request form, they can ask for anything. They can ask for painting. They can ask for any repairs that they saw from inspections. If you decide to terminate during due diligence, you do not owe the seller an explanation. You do not have to tell the seller I'm terminating because of this. The seller is not required to respond to that repair request. Basically paying the seller to take it off the market. Buyer can walk away for any reason. If you're going to submit that repair request, make sure that you're watching your deadline, that you do give the seller enough time to respond. If the buyer fails to deliver a termination fee at 6 o'clock that day, you have an as-is contract regardless of repair. You're required to get that termination fee and that check to the seller. The one thing that you can get out of with the contract, here's kind of I don't want to call this a contingency, but here is something. If you find that the seller knew, let's say they knew they had termites underneath. No, that's not a good one. If they had a PEX piping, any of you familiar with PEX piping? A lot of us down here are, because in this area in York County, between the time frame of like I'd say 2000 to 2007, 8, there was a big PEX problem with pipes. If that was not disclosed in the property disclosure, seller knows it, then technically you're supposed to be able to get out of the contract if that item was not disclosed and you found a problem. Again, all of this, in my opinion, they wrote this contract for the attorneys to make a killing off of. It may go into a lawsuit. Okay, going back down through the number 9, make sure that the inspectors are done with a South Carolina licensed and insured inspectors. Don't know why they still have seller grants buyer permission to connect utilities. The only time that I've ever run into that is if it was like a HUD or foreclosure and the utilities have been cut off, then you would check it there, but most of the time the utility is already on. Appraised value, again, that's a contingency, whether you're requiring it to appraise or not. Then if it is, it does not appraise, you get to renegotiate. Wood infestation, we've talked about that. Here's the other thing, you guys, in number 11, if you put in here that it must be no earlier than 30 days and prior to closing and no later than 3 calendar days prior to closing, make sure you give the seller enough notice and you don't wait until day number 4, like I just had a client do, to get to do the CL 100. Make sure that you give the seller enough time. The whole thing in these contracts is the more that we can cooperate with the other agent and work through as professionals, the much better off we are. So a lot of times that takes reeling in your client to make sure that they're doing the right thing. So again, pay close attention to these dates. Let's see, number 12 is pretty standard about brokers recommend buyer have a property surveyed, title examined. And again, as far as title examined, that is totally up to the buyer at the time. Do I have buyers that forego the title examination? I do. I do a lot. I do a lot. And it all depends on the type of property that they're buying. Like if you're buying land, potentially they don't. If you're buying a new build, potentially they don't. But that's up to the buyer. Okay, survival. This contract is is binding. So if the buyer passes away during the time of this contract, it goes to his estate. The estate is still buying it if they can. So just remember that. I did have a situation, just that very thing, that the client was in the car. She wasn't feeling well. She had lung cancer before, and she was coughing an awful lot. Fortunately, we had done due diligence. It's the one few times I've done due diligence over the past 10 years. And she was in the hospital. Her daughter-in-law called me and said, she's not doing well. We don't think she's going to make it. And I mean, this is all in a matter of 5 days. And I said, well, we need to get her to execute this due diligence. We need her signature, or it's going into the state. So they did get it to me, and we were able to execute the due diligence. So without it going into the state. So make sure you're aware of that. Also I know I've said this one time, but I'll repeat because it's, you're supposed to say something so many times before people sinks in. If this contract goes to court and you lose, you're paying the other person's attorney's fees and court fees. Make sure you understand that. Number 14, home warranty. Are you going to do a home warranty? That's up to you and the buyer and the seller, whether they want it and they're gonna grant it. Okay, number 15 is really interesting one. Love this one. Make sure you read this one. In case the property is damaged wholly or partially by fire or any other casualty prior to closing. Another casualty is flooding. In the case of the property is damaged wholly or partially by fire or other casualty prior to closing, parties have the right for 5 calendar days after notice of damage to deliver notice of termination to the other party. If the party does not deliver notice of termination, the parties proceed according to the contract, and seller is to be responsible to repair all damage, remit to the buyer an amount sufficient for repairs, or assign to the buyer the right to all proceeds of insurance and remit any deductible amount applicable to such casualty. If the buyer or inspections cause the damage, buyer is responsible for indemnifying the seller for damages. Brokers and parties should ensure that they are protected by appropriate risk management strategies such as insurance. This has happened to me. So I always focus on this because, again, in this contract, there is 5 calendar days. This is where you've got to know your calendar, your deadlines. Again, what happened to me was I had a buyer and they were buying a property over in TK. And the inspector, we set up the inspections and the inspector went over there. We did not go with the inspector at the time. We were meeting him later. Inspector walks in and the entire first floor was flooded. Entire first floor. Entire. And it was bad. I mean, it was deep and it was a mess. Well, the other agent and the broker said, if the seller was to fix it, we must proceed. No, because we got it terminated within 5 calendar days. So we submitted termination, and termination is unilateral, which means that only one person has to submit it. If someone submits you a termination, it's unilateral. You do not have to sign it. It's not, your signature is not required. It is absolutely terminated based on one person. So again, here's a 5 calendar days. So if I were you guys, I'd go through this contract. I'd highlight every one of these numbers in these paragraphs that have days dependent, and I make sure I was clear on all that. Okay, South Carolina residential property disclosure statement. You guys know that there are actually 2 of them. One discusses the HOA, and then the other one discusses the property itself. Make sure, please make sure and fill this thing out. I can't tell you how many times I get a property disclosure. The HVAC is not filled out, the age is not filled out, the roof is not filled out. If they've lived there in that house, they're responsible for filling it out. It is a crime not to fill it out accurately. You can go back. I'll give you an example. I bought a house down in Columbia, a rental property. Got the property disclosure, said that the roof was 5 years old. Okay, great. Had inspections. Inspector never says one word about the roof. Closed on the property. Several months later, I'm over there because I had gotten it from my daughter who was going to school. I was over at her house and I look up and I see the spot on the ceiling. I said, what is that? My daughter said, oh, yeah, it's leaking. It's been leaking. It's wet up there. I'm like, what? Go back to the property disclosure. And I said, it said 5 years. So I called the agent and I said, well, before I called the agent, I got the roofers on the roof. I had roofers go out there. I said, can you please tell me this roof is 5 years old and if it's any damage? The guy came down off the ladder without being up there 30 seconds. And he said, Karen, this roof's got to be 45, 50 years old. And it was an old house I bought. And I'm like, no, he told me it was 5. He said, well, he left off the 0. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. He said, no, this is bad. This whole roof's got to go. It's in bad shape. So I go back, and so I go to the listing agent. Well, of course, it was his rental property he had. So he was not happy with me. And he said, well, what is it that you want? And I said, well, I want a new roof. You didn't tell me the truth. So what did he have to do? He had to put a new roof on it. Not too many months later, when this was in the winter when I bought it, it started warming up. Air conditioner, I had to turn the air conditioner off. Well, the air conditioner wasn't working right. Went to the property disclosure statement, and the air conditioner said, I don't know, it was like 2 or 3 years old. God, the air conditioner guy is back underneath. And I said, this air conditioner 2 or 3 years old? And they said, oh my God, no, this thing is forever old. And I was like, okay. And so I went back to the seller, which was the agent again, and this time he's furious. And he says, well, what do you want? And I said, well, I want a new HVAC system. And I did prorate it back to the time at the age. I did take depreciation off of it because he said it was only a certain amount of years old. But he had to give it to me. He knew he had to. So the point of this story is, if they did not tell the truth on the property disclosure, and the age and the owners get in there, and several months later they find out that what was not true on the property disclosure, you can go back. A lot of agents do not know that, but you can go back because it is a crime to not tell the truth. And here's how you can find out if it's not the truth or not. There's a thing called the Freedom of Information Act. And in York County, you can go to yorkcounty.gov, yorkcountygov.com. And there is a form. It's called Freedom of Information form. You can fill it out. And then that's exactly what I did down in Columbia, and found, because if he had put a new roof on, like he had said 5 years ago, there would have been a permit on it. If he had put a new air conditioner in, like he had said there was, there'd have been a permit on it. Neither of them were there. So you just need to know the process, but you can go back. So a lot of people don't know that. Any questions on that? Okay, lead-based paint, you know that you have to, anything prior to 1978, you need to fill out the form and complete that. Sex offender, criminal information. Again, you're not allowed to tell them any of that, but the buyer is responsible for obtaining their own information on that. Okay, the trust, interest, charitable contribution. Are you going to allow them to put it in an earnest an interest-bearing trust account or not? I do not. I just check not. South Carolina income tax, non-resident gain in compliance, and USA federal income tax. Okay, this is a good one too. So you're selling a house that was a rental in South Carolina. And you go and you get the close, but the owner lives in North Carolina. there are going to be funds held out, capital gains held out on that closing document that seller is going to have. He's going to see that those funds are held. The attorneys automatically hold funds for capital gains. A lot of times agents don't know this, sellers don't know this, and the sellers are not happy about it. And I had this very thing happen to me the other day. I was the buyer side, and it was a rental. The seller lived in North Carolina. The closing document came out, and the agent called me up extremely upset and said, "Why is this attorney holding out?" It was $4,500, something like that. "Why is the attorney holding out $4,500? What are y'all doing there that you're doing it?" Like it was our issue. And I said, well, I anticipate that that's probably a capital gains that the attorney's holding out, because in South Carolina, as in majority of the places in the United States, there are only a few states that do not do that, but majority of the states do. Literally, there's only like 8 or 9 states that do not hold capital gains. And I said, I think it's a capital gains. You need to check with your accountant, and you need to check with the attorney. And sure enough, that's exactly what it is. So if you have that situation, because what happens is the seller will get mad at you if you don't know that information and you don't tell them. But it's really an accountant question. I'm an attorney question. This is entire and binding agreement, adjustments, default, mediation. Again, on this mediation, remember that whoever loses pays the money. Okay, non-reliance clause, non-merger, broker disclaimer. Brokers give no warranty or representation. Broker's compensation. The seller collects and pays the buyer's agent. All right, number 28, attachments and other contingencies, term and other stipulations. Okay, so if you do have to do any type of addendums for whatever reason, I don't know, they decide to change the closing date, you do a form 390, any type of addendum whatsoever, you need to write it here and then attach the form to this. Expiration of offer. Okay, so in this expiration of offer, this is really interesting. Sometimes I do them, sometimes I don't. If you have an expiration of offer, and if you don't have it, and you have a client that's putting in multiple contracts, different places, he could end up with 2 accepted contracts. So if I have a client that's putting multiple contracts in different places, I always do an expiration offer, and I make sure that they don't overlap. That's just FYI. And that's pretty much buyer's agent, email address, seller's information, buyer's information. That's pretty much it on this contract. Now, are there any questions? And that's pretty much it. I think I've covered it. Again, the big thing that happened in this contract that took effect June 13th was that the repair request and as is section came out. Other than that, everything is exactly the same. Now, let me give you the attorney's email at South Carolina. If you have a question and you want to talk to an attorney, it's Austin, AUSTIN, at screaltors.org. That is his email address. If you would like to contact an attorney and ask him any questions, and he will respond to you. All right. I am, all right, are there any other questions? Oh, also, when you are, if you're listing a house here, or if you're buying it, either way, make sure that you are aware of the septic and the sewer and water agent discovery. Make sure that that's completed, and that's supposed to be completed for each one of your transactions here in South Carolina. And majority of the time, there's so many permits that South Carolina, York County does not have, that because they've discarded them. But just fill out that form as well. We do not have mineral rights here in South Carolina, so you don't have to worry about filling out mineral rights. You do have to complete their residential property condition disclosure statement addendum, as well as the property condition disclosure statement, and the wire fraud document needs to be completed. If you're doing a new build here, all new builds that are the big builders have their own contracts. I will tell you to be careful with those contracts as well, because majority of them have a section in there that says the house, that they're not responsible if the house does not appraise. That's something to educate your clients on. Let's see. That pretty much covers the contract and the documents that must go along with it. Yeah, that's it. Any other questions? I know that it's 1:45 and we're getting done a little bit early on this. Any questions? No questions? Everybody feel good about due diligence? No one feel good about due diligence? Does everybody understand? Anyone there?
Yeah, we're here.
Good. I'm glad I haven't bored you to death. There are no questions. And if you ever have any questions, but you can feel free to give me a call. Rather you call me than to get into any problems, because it can be confusing, the due diligence side of it. Just remember, do not collect that money until the termination fee is executed, and do not hold that money. And do not write write on the contracts, because they consider that law language, and it's the responsibility of the attorneys to do that. All right, if there aren't any questions, that's all we've got for today.
Thank you, Karen.
All right, thank you so much. Yep, let me know if you have
Thank
any
you.
questions. Bye-bye.